How often should you podcast this year? This is an important question because whether you have a small podcast or a very well-known podcast, the topic of frequency plays an important role. Now, the question is, it's not just about how often should you podcast. It's about the resources that you have at your disposal. And by resources, I'm talking here about the logistical resources, human resources, monetary resources, and so on and so forth. So the big question this year is it's not just about the resources, but also about the kind of target audiences that you are going after. Because listen, think about it. If you're going after a target audience that really doesn't care about you podcasting weekly, then why should you do it in the first place? There has to be a sync. There has to be a synchronization between how often you podcast and your audience's appetite. So here's a strategy I really want to share with you. And the thing is that when you actually envision, let's say, a daily podcast schedule or a weekly podcast schedule, you got to really think twice about the resources, about the kind of brainstorming that has to go through everything. Okay, and it's not just about of course, a little earlier I was just telling you about I was talking about human resources, monetary resources, but also you got to really think also about the technological resources. I mean, do you actually publish? Where do you publish your podcast? Where do you host your podcast? Do you use YouTube? In other words, a free one, or do you use one that's really that you are paying for, right? Because you got to really also think about the storage limits, because the podcast, the host, sometimes they might impose upon you or upon users a limit when it comes to storage. So when you think about actually publishing once a week or publishing once every 2 weeks, there is an element of hosting capability to really think about. So long story short, the strategy here is that for you to actually think about how often you should podcast, you got to think about all those resources that will go into whatever frequency you actually choose in the first place. If you choose weekly, I mean, the funny thing is some people even have a daily podcast. You can have daily podcasts. You can have a 10-minute podcast or a 30-minute podcast daily if you're really inspired and you have the resources. Also, you have a team behind you. So the thing is, when you think about resources, when you think about frequency, you got to really also think about quantity versus quality. I mean, this is actually an age-old debate between a qualitative aspect of something and quantitative aspect of something. So if you are going to if you choose a short, like if you choose let's say a more frequent sort of cadence, let's say you want to really a podcast once a week, then you got to really ask yourself, do I have the resources to actually produce quality, right? It's not just about quantity, because you have to really think about adding value to your target audience. Your audience is really the mass that's going to drive your podcast from zero to hero. That's really important. Don't try to really don't crank out like content like crazy, and then you realize the last thing you want is to have a cheap ass content. You do not want to have cheap ass content, because otherwise, you know what? When it comes to podcasting, you have a very selective audience. Folks are giving you let's say 30 minutes of their day or 1 hour of their day. If they actually tune in once and they realize that your content is crappy, they are not coming back. I mean, you can be sure of that. So when you think about quantity versus quality, you got to really ask yourself, if I go with a certain quantity, do I have the resources to actually follow through, right? Not just follow through, but also keep up. I mean, because, podcasting is actually a long-term, this is a long-term game. And it's not just a game, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint, okay? Some people feel like that, people actually feel that keeping your content as new as possible in order to actually trigger Google's freshness algorithm is what's important, right? But the thing is, do not let Google tell you how to work or live. Don't let Bing let you know how to work or live, right? It's all about you adding value to your audience. People get listening fatigue. If you are releasing episodes frequently, you run the risk of being repetitive, and some people feel that quantity is the way to get attention. They think that, let's say, more episodes mean more downloads, and this results in higher rankings and podcast chart and also a high revenue in terms of advertising, right? If your show sounds sloppy or doesn't deliver on its promises, you will not keep listeners. I can guarantee you that for sure. I mean, people will come listen once and then their asses are out of there. The word of mouth that you generate will not be positive. Some topics and shows are good to release frequently, but you got to really ask yourself what kind of niche are you in, right? Again, if your podcast is just you and a few sound cues and you have good systems in place, terrific. So when I talk about how often you should podcast, you got to really ask yourself, do you want to go into daily discussions or weekly discussions or fortnightly discussions or even monthly discussions, okay? And it's one of those things where like the frequency you choose has to be in sync with the kind of topic that you cover, right? Now, when I talk about daily discussions, for instance, you got to really ask yourself, does your topic change frequently? If your topic changes frequently, then you have to really be as frequent as possible to stay fresh. Okay, that's an important element. Let me give you an example. If you have, let's say you have a daily, so you have a daily news event and your podcast revolves around daily news event, or you have a podcast around, let's say financial news, for instance, then the thing is that you got to really be as relevant because the big players in the industry, they are publishing like crazy. Like you take CNN or you take Bloomberg, to name a few, they are publishing like 10, 15, or 20 videos or audios a day. And so if you are trying to compete with those behemoths, you better have a certain critical mass. And the critical mass can be what? It can be your resources. It can be your inspiration too. Because see, the thing is, it's not just about you trying to really go after those big players. You got to have the inspiration too. You got to have you got to be able to say something that makes sense, that your audience is willing to listen to, right? If you're just talking just to talk, people will figure out really fast that you are not the real thing. So daily discussions could be a possibility if you are in the right niche, and if your audience, again, your audience actually needs that kind of daily updates. See, the thing is, when you think about frequency, I think I've made this point before. When you are thinking about frequency, I want you to think back from what your audience is looking for. If your audience want to have a daily frequency, want to have a daily episode, why not? If your audience will feel a lot of value through a weekly episode, why not? Through a fortnightly episode, why not? So your audience has to actually drive the frequency here. The thing is, if you're trying to have daily discussions, you can also try another strategy, because if you're thinking about how often you should podcast, it doesn't mean that all the podcasts that you actually release should actually be online after you release them, because you can also try to have a disappearing episode sort of pattern, right? So what happens here is that you tell your audience, let's say you can tell your audience 1 week in advance that, hey, listen, on this day, I'll release a few episodes, and the episode will be online for 24 hours or 48 hours. And after that, they'll just disappear. And it's a strategy too. I mean, the whole thing here is that when you have disappearing episodes, that creates a certain elements of exclusivity, right? It creates an element of, let's say, FOMO, if you will, fear of missing out. So when you have this pattern of exclusivity, that really confers to your podcast a certain aura of prestige, because the info is so preeminent, is so important that it's only there for 24 hours or 48 hours. And this will actually could I want to insist on this. There is no certainty, but this could actually drive your audience to actually tune in real fast, because they know there is a certain element of timing here. And if they're not in the right chronology, they might actually lose the info that you're sharing with them, right? But again, going back to what I said about quality versus quantity, if the quality is there, people will be tuning in, and as a matter of fact, people can actually pay you. So if you have a disappearing episode pattern, for instance, folks might actually be paying you for them to actually have access to to your episodes for a long time. So if you say, for instance, my episode will be free after 24 hours, then folks who are willing to pay for it, they could actually listen to the episode. Let's say after 1 week or after 1 year. Okay, so this is an important element. Now, one thing I want to say about disappearing episodes is that you got to really make sure that you are actually you are covering a topic that really makes sense, so that when you actually have the episode disappear, folks will really care about, like your listeners would really care about actually tuning in and really finding about the info. Because if you cover a very lame topic, it's not really worth it. When you think about how often you should podcast, you can also think about seasons, right? I mean, like if you like, when was the last time you thought about your favorite show? And you have season one, season two, season three. Think about Netflix. Think about Amazon Prime. Think about Disney. Think about all those ABC. Think about all those big multimedia companies, right? They have the season. So the thing is that when you are actually thinking like, if you have an opportunity to sort of slice and dice your episodes through seasons, that's kind of cool, because seasons let you and your listeners have a break. Take a vacation. Let the listeners miss you. Give yourself time to think about new episodes without constant feedback, right? You want to go back into that little inside you and really dig deep. You want to dig deep. Take a breather. Like, you want to walk a little bit and go talk to your granddad, to your favorite grandmother. You want to really resource yourself. Get some resourcing. That's an important element to think about too, because see, when you think about podcasting, it's all about inspiration. You got to have the inspiration. It's not just about you talking to a microphone and really speaking nonsense or speaking good sense for that matter. No, you have to really pace yourself. As I said a little earlier, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. So do some pre-season planning, redo your website, dream up some exciting merchandise. When you come back, you can start a new marathon of making content and listening together. It's all about really also diversifying your sources of revenue, your avenues of revenue, right? Like merch, for instance. That's another way to monetize your show. When you think about, because see, when you think about podcasting, advertising shouldn't be the only avenue for revenue, okay? And you can think about having driving traffic to your website, actually, merch, social media, and so on and so forth. You can also think about sponsoring. I mean, brand sponsors are there, especially when you have quality. Brands will flock to your show, that's for sure. So seasons also are a great opportunity when it comes to timing your podcast. So when you think about how often you should podcast, I mean, it's important to really understand the element of routine. Routine is really important in the sense that it creates certainty, it creates availability, and most importantly, it creates efficiency. When you are used to doing something over and over and over and over, guess what? You are going to be better anyway, right? I mean, think about the things that you were doing 10 years ago, and today you are good at it. You are the best at it because you were actually doing it over and over and over. So a lot of habits are structured around a weekly calendar. This is the day we wash our clothes. This is the day we go grocery shopping. This is the day where we call our granddad. This is the day where we do this. The day where we do that, right? And Sunday and Thursday have been must see TV nights, and podcasts tend to actually pile up for the Monday morning commute. I mean, you got to really go back to asking yourself, do I know my target audience? Who are my listeners? What are those psychographics? What are their psychographics? What are their demographics? What kind of chronology am I working with? What kind of timing? The more you know about your target audience, the more you know about your listeners, the better, because then you can tailor your offer to them. Okay, and this is an important element when I talk about using habits to your advantage. The element of timing is important. The element, because when you actually think about how often you should podcast, it's not just about the frequency. It's about the day during the week also. Okay, and so if you release your episodes on the same weekday on a consistent basis, whether it's once a month or once a week, you become a habit, right? Folks start to trust you. Folks start to like put you into their calendars, and and this is kind of cool. Now, is there a day of the week to release new podcast episodes? Well, you might ask. That's a really good. That's a good question. But this only you can answer that question because consistency is always a great idea. If your audience is actually free on Monday evening, okay, go for Monday evening. If they are free on a Thursday afternoon, okay, do a Thursday afternoon. If they are available on the weekend, then you know that this is really an important element to actually create that sort of forge that relationship. Okay, and so do you want to have a number of times per month? So the important thing is that as long as you are actually staying the same over time, you are consistent because consistency is really what's important, not quantity, consistency. So Google's freshness algorithm doesn't necessarily mean that frequently posted new content is better than consistently useful, enjoyable content. So quality always triumphs over quantity. I've said this before, right? Because listeners remember the podcasts that are consistently satisfying. And so this is an important element for them to think about. So when you think about how often you should podcast, there has to be a conversation between you and your audience because remember, your audience is the one listening to your shows. Your listeners are the one trusting you with the quality work you are doing. So when you actually are thinking about switching the timing or even initiating a certain time, you want to have that conversation. Now you can have a conversation reactively or proactively. Reactively means what? You can ask a survey what people think about a certain time that you choose. And when you think about proactively, you can ask in a different survey what day or days your audience will love to have you actually release a podcast. So you have the possibility of doing both, okay? But long story short, it's important to really keep your audience informed because that tells them, hey, listen, that you are actually you are reliable, that you trust your audience, that you want to forge a relationship with them, right? So when you actually thinking about podcasting, there has to be this sort of a long-term relationship. Well, that actually starts as as you providing information to your audience, and then actually it turns into a relationship, like a mutually beneficial relationship. Your audience trusts you with your thought leadership, and you trust your audience with their ability to help you monetize your podcast a lot further. And that's going to help you actually in terms of scalability also. Because when you think about scalability, it means what? It means you're doing the same thing, the same thing you've been doing, let's say 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but now the scale is different. The magnitude is different. You have a larger magnitude. I mean, you have a larger scale. That's really the very essence of scalability. And from a scalability point of view, if you already have that kind of relationship with your audience, then you don't have an audience anymore. You know what you have now? You have a community. You have a community with whom you can actually engage. You can also get inspiration from, and you can also give back to a whole lot back to. This is really quite essential to think in those terms. So here's a recap to this conversation. I've been talking to you about how often you should podcast, and I give you the strategy and now the recap. Thank you so much. God bless you. I will see you next time. Until then, remember, stay marvelous.